May I introduce today evening's first speaker, Dr. Swapna Liddle. Swapna is a historian with a special interest in Delhi. She wrote a PhD thesis on cultural and intellectual change in Delhi under the rule of the East India Company, and then extended her study to the development of Delhi as an imperial capital city, particularly under Mughal and British rule. For many years, she has also been closely involved in the movement to preserve historic sites and monuments. And coming from Delhi and coming from, the Delhi University, I know that she's been in the forefront of many campaigns to save heritage. So, Swapna is, she's the author of The Broken Script. I'd urge you to pick up a copy at the back because there's some incredible insights based on some palace documents and all which he's accessed. And many other books. She's written about, the Connaught Place and the making of New Delhi, Chandni Chowk, the Mughal city of Old Delhi, and of course, a book on some historic walks in Delhi. So, Swapna, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Paul, for many kindnesses, for that lovely introduction, for bringing me here. I mean, when people were talking about since the book came out very recently, people have been asking me, so when are you, talking about some of the themes in the book? And I said, the first one of these is in Mumbai. And they said, really? Not Delhi, you're going to Mumbai? I said, well, I've been invited by Sir Maya. So that was... so really very grateful for that. And it's a lovely city. I love to come. And, it's interesting. I'm a 19th century historian, and I find that there is very little monumental architecture in Delhi which is from the 19th century. Practically nothing. And when I come to Bombay and I see all of this, it's absolutely fabulous. I spent, as I was just saying, I spent 4 hours this morning just walking. It was so lovely. But to come to the subject of the talk today, it's the Delhi Renaissance, and as you can see in quotes, because what is the Delhi Renaissance after all? And the subtitle is The Indigenous Roots of Colonial Modernity. Now, the Delhi Renaissance was a phrase, a term that was first used, I think, by C.F. Andrews, the great Gandhian teacher. And he was writing about a period in Delhi's history of when Delhi was ruled by the East India Company. And this rule of the East India Company extends from 1803 in Delhi. That's when Delhi was conquered by the British, and extends to 1857, when the Great Revolt happened. And of course, as we all know, that was the end of the East India Company's rule over India, because from 1858 onwards, it was the British Crown that took over direct administration of the country. So it's this period. And Andrews, of course, was talking about various aspects of change that was happening, and he was talking mostly about really the colonial modernity part of it. Modernity had already come into India in many different ways. I mean, the Mughals are, this is not part of my talk, and certainly not part of my study, but the Mughals are definitely modern in many ways. But that's the subject for another scholar and another talk. But what definitely one, so it is colonial modernity that Andrews was talking about, and that his theory was that this has happened mainly in this period. This is when it first happened in Delhi. And this coincided with the rule of the East India Company. In fact, it actually grew from that. And how it grew was because there were certain institutions, and the institution that he was talking about was essentially the Delhi College, which then fostered a sort of interaction between Indian scholars, Indian literary figures, etc. And then this new, with an interaction and basically teaching of sciences, etc., Western sciences in the Indian, vernacular, as they call it at that point of time in Delhi, which was Urdu, that this grew. So he called this the Renaissance, and the reason he called it the Renaissance, of course, was because he was drawing a direct comparison with the Bengal Renaissance, which is a period of reform, it is a period of new learning, a new different kind of colonial modernity again. So, but as I think Andrews did get it right in some ways, but I think he was very limited in his appreciation of what exactly all this stood for. And that is what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to stress the indigenous roots part of it today. So, first of all, there has been Andrews has been one of the rare ones who've even talked about this aspect of Delhi, because for the most part, when even historians, I mean, I'm not talking about people who are, less well informed about this, but I'm saying even historians who have, or people writing literary criticism, analyzing the literature of the period, etc., have often portrayed this period in Delhi's history. And for those who don't know or may have forgotten, this is also, the company period is also the period when the Mughal emperor is still in the Red Fort. And you have 3 Mughal emperors in this period. For a very short while, Shah Alam II, then Akbar II, and followed by Bahadur Shah Zafar. So Bahadur Shah II, again, pen-named Zafar. So it is the Mughal period also. This is also the period of the great Urdu poets, Urdu and Persian poets. It's the period of Ghalib and Momin and Azurda and Zauq and Bahadur Shah Zafar, of course, also being a poet. So this culture is portrayed as an essentially traditional one. The Mughal court and culture. In fact, as I said, even historians have blithely, as a cliche, repeated this proposition that before 1857, Delhi was practically unchanged. The colonial culture had not touched it at all. So, you get a sort of feel of a city that is, the Mughal emperor is sitting in his court and he's doing these poetic gatherings, these mushairas, and all that sort of thing is happening. And people are in a sort of a time warp. They are still living in this old Mughal age, and colonial modernity has not touched it. That is what I actually challenge. And for one thing, we must realize the background of Delhi as it comes into the early 19th century. Before even the East India Company conquers Delhi, Delhi has been a center of learning, a center of culture, the center of the development of the Urdu language, of Urdu poetry, deep and learning on all sorts of, in all sorts of ways. Very important institutions of learning, plus also a deep culture of learning that was imparted through, sometimes when we think of learning and culture, we think only of institutions. We think of colleges, we think of schools. And while that is important, that was not the only way in which learning was imparted. And in Delhi of the late 18th century, a very important part of that, of the transmission of learning was individual Ustad-Shagird relationships, equivalent to the Guru-Shishya Parampara. People of wealth and knowledge were themselves scholars and would, in their free time, teach students. And it was a flexible system. they would, if you were, for instance, interested in mathematics or you were interested in astronomy, you would go, a young person would go to, and it was invariably a man, women's education was not beyond the immediate household, there was not a lot outside. But if you were interested in a particular subject, you went to an ustad. You went to somebody who was knowledgeable in that field, and you asked that person to teach you. So that kind of system had carried on even when a lot of the more formal institutions had decayed. There were, of course, the Mughals used to, used to pay for important educational institutions, but all that had died out in the late 18th century because of the political upheavals that had, gone on before the East India Company conquered everybody and put an end to that struggle. But what I'm saying is that this tradition of learning produced people who were and even though Delhi was at that time not a part of the Mughal, not a part of the East India Company's territories, the people from Delhi were very important participants in the colonial culture that was developing. Fort William, for instance. Everybody's heard of Fort William. And the fact that it was taking important strides in the production of, for instance, prose writing in Urdu. There's all about John Gilchrist, who was the head of that, and also his efforts to standardize Urdu prose, to create a difference mark out a difference between Urdu and Hindi and all those kind of developments. What we don't realize is that a lot of that is happening with the, unfortunately what used to happen was that a lot of these British heads of these institutions did not acknowledge the role that was played by Indians in this production of knowledge. So one of the important people there is Mir Amman. Mir Amman Dehlvi is a Delhi person, and he contributes in a large part to this prose writing that is happening through his translations, for instance. So his translations, his compositions, what he writes about how the Urdu language is developing, so whether it's studying the Urdu language, etc. So a Delhi person is involved in that. There are other Delhi people who are making great contributions to how the Urdu language is evolving and what its history is. There is Inshallah Khan Insha. Everybody thinks that John Gilchrist was the only one who was talking about a Hindi which was different from Urdu in the sense that it was free of Persian and Arabic language, etc. The same work or similar sort of work was being done independently by somebody who was outside that Fort William, and that's Inshallah Khan Insha. So, and all this is happening before the East India Company even enters Delhi. The other kind of person who's involved in the East India Company's efforts are the kind of scholar, diplomat kind of person. One of them is Khwaja Farid, one of them is Mir Izzatullah. These are people, again, who are very learned, who are well respected, they are from eminent families, and the British use them as their, shall we say, the front men when they go on diplomatic missions. So whether it is Ava in the east or it is the northwest, Central Asia, etc., all of these people are the ones who are, because the British, they are much better mediators. They are the ones who can talk Persian, and in a culture that is, intelligible to the people they are interacting with, much, much better than any British officials could be in those days. I mean, we tend to think, and the British Orientalist discourse was that there were these British scholars who were very well versed in Persian, etc. But there were no match for these guys. And these guys were at the front of this. So you have this long tradition of Delhi people who are going and are already engaging with the British colonial institutions. It is in this context that the East India Company came and conquered Delhi and started, in time, the Delhi College. And I've mentioned the Delhi College. Delhi College, established in 1825, was the first Western-style college, institution of higher learning in Delhi. And there again, it is interesting because it is different from many other kinds of institutions that were set up by the British East India Company all around the country. And what really sets it apart is the fact that it was a place where modern learning, and by that the British actually meant Western sciences, Western pedagogy in general, all this was going to be taught through the medium of Urdu, which was the local vernacular. That idea that a vernacular would be used for the teaching of modern sciences and modern learning was not a model that the British followed seriously in many other places, particularly in higher education, because either they sponsored what were typically institutions of traditional learning, Oriental colleges in different places, or they set up modern, English language institutions. This particular combination really only happened significantly in Delhi, and it was, the reason behind it was very interesting also, because the impetus of this came from a fund, a large sum of money, 1.7 lakhs, which in those days was quite a large amount of money, which was contributed by a man who was from Delhi, Fazl Ali Khan. And Fazl Ali Khan was he was the Prime Minister of the Nawab of Awadh. And he was the one who gave this money for education, which went into this college. And because it went into this college, they had to create this particular model, because the British East India Company, for its own reasons, wanted a institution of higher education which would create, and by this time you have Bentinck, etc., coming up and making those statements. And Bentinck's brother-in-law, Trevelyan, who talked about the spread of, the desirability to spread English or Western education in India, in fact, his early career was also spent in Delhi. So Trevelyan's first ideas about the importance of Western education were started in the context of Delhi. So those ideas come in Delhi, but at the same time, because of this fund, which was specially earmarked for the study of Indian languages, that the college took a particular form. It taught modern sciences, etc., Western subjects, economics, law, Western law that the East India Company was now introducing in India, but it taught them to quite an extent. They had English classes also, but to quite a significant extent also Urdu. And in this, they also had an important translation program. So it was coming through translations as well. But it was not just a question of an Indian providing a fund which produces this particular kind of amalgam. There was, and it was not only about translations, because there was original work coming out of this institution as well. And one of those people who's involved in this is somebody called Master Ramchandar. Ramchandar was, he was a scientist. He had studied in the Delhi College, he had studied in the English class, he was interested in mathematics, and he started teaching at the college right after he graduated. He was, not only was he an active participant in the translation program, he also did original work in mathematics. And one of his best known work actually it's called it's about solving the problems of maxima and minima through algebra. Now, the idea that calculus can be understood through algebra was quite an innovative one. And the reason for that really is because, as Ramchandar appreciates, he said the Indian tradition is strong in algebra, Bij Ganit. So the Indian tradition is strong in algebra. If Indians are to understand calculus, which is a new and it's a new thing for them, it's a new concept, you should translate it into forms, into systems that they understand. So so the translation is not simply a translation of language, but it is a translation of systems of understanding, of knowledge. So that was one of the kinds of things that he was doing. But Ramchandar, of course, is interested in a lot of other things. And a lot of it is about social reform. So that would have fitted in quite well with what, I think that is what C.F. Andrews had in mind when he talked about the Delhi Renaissance, because Delhi also is a site for a lot of discussion on social reform. I mean, we know about Bengal, for instance, we know about Bombay, but we don't talk very much about Delhi, and particularly Delhi before 1857, no. But there is a lot that's going on. There are the popular press plays a very important role in this. And the popular press, again, there are figures like Muhammad Baqir, who started the Delhi Urdu Akhbar. And the newspapers in Delhi also, though they owe the major thing that they owe to the Western newspaper, Western style, in the English language newspaper or English print journalism, is the process of print. But the akhbar, the newsletters, it owes a lot to the earlier newsletters that used to come out, because there was a tradition of akhbarat, of newsletters that used to be there, which were handwritten, and they were very, very similar to the kind of trajectory that the Delhi Urdu Akhbar and other newspapers take after that. So even in the print journalism sphere, the Delhi developments are to a large extent draw from the earlier tradition. I was talking about Ramchandar and reform. So Ramchandar was also a journalist. He brought out these popular science journals, and he brought out journals which actually combined. These were popular. These were meant for a general reading public, and they were to popularize new developments in science and technology, and talk about things like even in institutions. For instance, in one, he talks about the separation of powers, how the judiciary and executive should be separate, and he discusses that. He talks about things like about how religious texts give very inaccurate explanations of natural phenomena. So he says religion is anti-science. He talks about the prevalence or not he actually. It's he talks about the defects of the Indian system of learning, particularly in not system of learning, but the system of the prevalent literature, which was heavily focused on poetry. He had a thing, he had it in for poetry, by the way. That's another idiosyncrasy of his. But the Delhi Urdu Akhbar, for instance, it talks about it, there's a long discussion through letters, through correspondence, through articles about widow remarriage, and how widow remarriage should happen. So it's all this that is happening, but it is also happening in the context of people who come from a milieu that many of them have actually also had a traditional education. Not all of these people are from the Delhi College either. Or some of them who are actually attend the college only for 3 or 4 years, but before that they've been very much immersed in the traditional system of education. And one of them, for instance, is Sayyid Ahmad Khan. Now, Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who is, of course, at the later period known as a great religious and social reformer, and is associated with, it's this period of this period of reform is seen as coming after the revolt. Now, he does not go to the Delhi College. All his education is in the so-called traditional system. Started off by studying at home, then he goes out and, various ustads, he studies various books under. He continues his studies right up to his 30s. He is going to various ustads and learning the things that he is interested in. That's a wonderful, it was a wonderful model. There was no strict curriculum. Somebody who was interested in a particular subject could approach a master in that subject and say, please teach me. And that's how he learns. And the idea, I think, of this kind of very flexible system of education where the creativity initiative of the individual is being encouraged. I mean, of course, it's far from being universal. These are members of the elite who can follow this kind of path anyway. But still, this kind of, it leads to developments which are way beyond, shall we say, colonial initiatives. And I'll give you one example. For instance, even in the field of Urdu poetry, in the field of the mushaira is a gathering of poets. It's an assembly of poets where poets recite their poems, but it's not a simple, shall we say, recitation of poems. It's also where your poetry is then discussed. You may say a few verses and then your peers will evaluate it. So, it was that was the original mushaira format that was there. And one of the people who had studied in the Indian section of the Delhi College, he had actually studied in the Persian class. He started this idea of using print he started a series of what I refer to as the print mushaira. Because what he does is, he holds these mushairas and then he uses all the poetry that comes out of it he publishes it on a fortnightly basis. And that not only that, but the proliferation of Urdu poetry that begins from that through print transforms Urdu poetry also. It democratizes it to a large extent. That democratization actually is happening in this period. And this talk is too short to go into many details of that, but this is definitely a very important area in which change is happening. And it's innovative. Karimuddin had another innovation. He wrote a book which was a kind of a domestic manual for women. Now, domestic manuals for women, I don't know how many of them, when they start coming out in this part of the country, the first Marathi women's manuals, but in Bengal, certainly, the first Bengali ones come out in the second half of the 19th century. He wrote one which was before this, and it's the regular kind, it's about instructing women how to be, how to manage homes, from practical problems to more esoteric things like what duties their religion enjoins on them as housewives and mothers and stuff like that. So these are things that are coming out of Delhi at that period. I'd like to, one of the institutions, again, which I would like to mention, is something called the Delhi Archaeological Society. Now, I am very interested in Delhi's monuments, so I find this really particularly interesting. The Delhi Archaeological Society was set up in the 1840s, and it was really the first, and it did all sorts of interesting things. It had a reach that was beyond Delhi. It was in Delhi, but also had mostly, its members were drawn from mainly the British officer class in North India. And the reason why it was mostly British membership, because the membership fee was high. And Indians, whether they were officials or whatever, did not have that kind of income to enable them to join. But here again, in the Delhi Archaeological Society, which did all sorts of things, it did studies, it also did conservation work. Conservation work was done in the Firozshah Kotla, which is an important monument of the 14th century fortress in Delhi. It did repairs to the Jantar Mantar, the sort of observatory, which is in Delhi, 18th century observatory. So it did this, and two of the main contributors to this work of the Delhi Archaeological Society were Indians. And both of them were Indians who had no connection with the Delhi College. They had studied in the so-called traditional system. One of them was Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who in fact did a lot of interesting work in Indian archaeology. And this is theoretical work. It's not like the early British archaeologists who actually go and dig places, take out artifacts and go and display them in museums. He is actually studying bricks. He's studying the size of bricks. He is making, he made the proposition that by the size of bricks, you can identify the date, you can date buildings. So, he makes that contribution. The other person was Ziauddin Khan, and Ziauddin Khan was a nobleman, and he was also a Delhi person, also a member of the society. He made again important contributions. He studies of coins. He helped to identify the locations of many of the Delhi's historic cities. I mean, we know now that Delhi has had several cities in different sites around basically one area, but he helped to identify that. He helped to identify the history of the Qutub Minar complex based on the inscriptions which were to be found on the buildings there. So, and on other texts as well. So these kind of contributions were being made. So basically the short point is that a lot of Indians, and not necessarily those who had a Western education, were contributing to ways and to institutions which were a part of the kind of colonial modernity that we talk about. And they were in fact in many ways more creative than their European counterparts in those institutions at that particular time. I think I will end with a little bit of what happened? What happened then? Why is it that not only did this thing, nobody talks about it anymore? Why did the Delhi College not continue what it was doing? Teaching higher education through the medium of a vernacular. What has happened? Why does the Delhi Archaeological Society then not spearhead, archaeological work all over the country? And the answer is 1857. The revolt of 1857, it had a tremendous impact on Delhi. Delhi was an important center of the revolt. A lot of people gathered at Delhi. The soldiers who had mutinied all over North India converged on Delhi. It was turned into and they asked Bahadur Shah Zafar, who ultimately agreed to lead them as their leader. And one thing that I should have mentioned, and I will mention it now, Bahadur Shah Zafar. I've talked very little about the Mughal emperors here because I was talking about other institutions. But even the Mughals, this whole image of them sitting around reciting poetry and not doing anything is a very misleading one. Their situation was difficult. Their empire had, of course, long gone, but they now faced a reality where they had no actual political power. No practical political power. They had a lot of influence, they had a lot of symbolic value, but they had no particular, the empire was past. But it doesn't mean that they sat around and did nothing about it. They tried to assert themselves to the extent they could, and in doing so, the revolt is not a part of that effort. That happens despite them, because that happens because certain soldiers rebel, mutiny, they come to Delhi, and then Bahadur Shah is persuaded to take up leadership. But the Mughal emperors, their own efforts are they use very modern means. So we all know, or I hope some of you at least would know this, that Akbar II, the father of Bahadur Shah, he had sent Raja Ram Mohan Roy as his emissary to Britain, to press his case about all the ways in which the British had gone back on the promises they had made, on the agreements they had entered into with the Mughals. So he had sent those. Very few of us realize that Bahadur Shah also sent an embassy to Britain. And the person he picked there was George Thompson. George Thompson, who was anti-slavery activist. He was a great orator. He had worked in this cause for in America, in Britain, and he was invited to India by Dwarkanath Tagore. And he took an important. And in Britain, he had formed the India Association, where he advocated very strongly to raise awareness about the oppression that Indian people in India were suffering, which the British public, he said, did not know enough of. So this is the kind of person that Bahadur Shah, what he does is he sends his minister, Ahsanullah Khan, to Calcutta. When he hears that this man has arrived, he sends this man to Calcutta to invite him to Delhi. And he comes to Delhi, and Bahadur Shah then says, my case, please take it to the East India Company and to the British government. And then George Thompson, of course, goes for this. So what I wanted to say was that this is the Mughal emperor, of course. He has an awareness of what global politics is, what an anti-slavery activist can or potentially could do. The importance of that. He's not sending his own minister there. He knows that will be ineffectual. So he's using the tools that he has. So again, as I said, that whole idea that these are people who are living in the past is so very wrong. But 1857, what that does is it fractures a lot of this. Mughals, of course, are finished, but Delhi also gets sort of relegated to a kind of a backwater. And in that process, all these institutions, whether it's the Delhi College, whether it is the Delhi Archaeological Society, these are all finished. And they are finished so comprehensively that later when one of the members of the Delhi Archaeological Society, Alexander Cunningham, he is the one who later is instrumental in the setting up of the Archaeological Survey of India, does not acknowledge that such a body had existed. He doesn't even mention it, that this had existed and the work it did. And he, even when he's talking about, say, one of his first reports is on Delhi, and he talks about the identification of various sites of the different cities, he does not acknowledge the work of Ziauddin Khan, for instance. He just doesn't mention it. So that is the problem, that 1857 acts as a sort of disruptor in this, and it finishes off that path of modernity with a lot more original contribution from learned Indians, who had been educated in an Indian system. That gets disrupted. So that's why we don't have very much being written on these things. So I think I will stop here. And I think, should we take a few questions, if there are any? I'd be happy to take those.
Good evening, Doctor. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I would very much appreciate if you tell me the birth of the Nazm in Urdu poetry took place during the period of EIC or during the period of Raj?
First of all, I must confess that I'm not a great. My acquaintance with Urdu poetry is very, very sketchy. But the only thing I will say is, and this I have talked about this in my book a little bit, about how there is in this period. Your specific question, I don't have an answer to. I don't know, but what is happening in Delhi in this period is that there is a questioning of what is the role of poetry. Should we have forms like the ghazal, which is, according to the detractors, I'm not saying this is what the ghazal only is, but its detractors are saying that this is a preoccupation with frivolities of love and all that sort of thing, and it does not deal with real problems of life, of so there are people like, for instance, Karimuddin, people like Master Ramchandar, who are talking about there should be poetry which is different, which has a relationship to actual the human lived condition. And not only that, it has to play a utilitarian role in, generating the right passions in people, So those kind of things, the content of poetry is being debated at the time. But your specific questions, I'm sorry, I don't know.
As far as I remember, rightly or wrongly, I understand that what you are saying is absolutely right, that the murmurs in the Urdu poetry had already started from the ghazal, which was a very different set of work. During the time of, just prior to 1857, but later on after 1857, when patriotism and independence, the War of Independence and various other matters came up, that was the time perhaps when Nazm was introduced in Urdu poetry with the encouragement of the British, for that matter. The reason being that they were quite keen that various other new subjects are introduced in Urdu poetry, and Lahore that time became the center of Nazm rather than Delhi, if I'm not mistaken.
There again, I think the important role is that of the Delhi diaspora.
Yes.
For instance, you have Muhammad Hussain Azad, who's the secretary of the Anjuman-e-Punjab.
Absolutely.
He is, Muhammad Hussain Azad is a Delhi person. He is in fact Muhammad Baqir's son. So Hali is also educated in Delhi. So, a lot of the things that have begun in Delhi then shift to other places. A lot of it. Yeah. Are we done? Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Subscribe to Sarmaya and be a part of the stories and conversations around art, history, and culture.